My nephew called my daughter too dumb for his Christmas gift, so I quietly cut off one payment. And his fairy tale dream shattered overnight. At Christmas, my brother's son said my kid was too dumb for the video game they got. My brother didn't correct him. He just helped clean up. That night, I took the console out of the living room. And at 9:03 a.m., I quietly canceled my brother's and his family's rent. And when they found out, then that Christmas morning during the gift exchange at our parents' house, he stood behind my daughter as she carefully unwrapped the box from him and his wife. It was a brand new gaming console. I actually thought for a split second that maybe he tried to do something kind. My daughter Leia is 10, quiet, modest, and so easily overlooked by louder personalities in the family. She smiled at the box, running her fingers along the picture on the packaging like she was trying to memorize it. That's when Evan leaned in, his breath close to her ear, and said, "You wouldn't get this game anyway. You're too shy for it. Too slow." Leia froze. Before she could even process it, Tyler, his 12-year-old, chimed in, "Yeah, you just mess it up." It was one of those moments where time stretches. My parents were still chatting over coffee. My mom was passing cookies around and I was waiting for Evan to correct his kid or at least soften what he just said. Nothing, he didn't even glance at Leia. His wife smirked like it was harmless fun. I didn't make a scene. I've learned with them that confrontation just feeds whatever game they're playing. Instead, I gathered up torn wrapping paper and empty boxes, carrying them into the kitchen. I could feel Leia's eyes on me for a moment before she looked away. The rest of the day was a slow burn. Tyler set up the console in the living room like it belonged to him. The controller never left his hands. Leia didn't ask to play. She sat in the corner with a library book she brought in her bag, turning pages so quietly you could almost miss she was there. And all the while, Evan acted like nothing had happened, like the console was some generous gift, not a tool to remind my daughter of where she ranked in his version of the family. By the time we got home that evening, I'd made up my mind. At 9 o'clock, after Leia was asleep, I walked into the living room. The console sat under the TV, wires trailing neatly into the wall. I unplugged each one, wrapped them up, and carried the whole thing to my bedroom closet. I set it on the shelf, shut the door, and stood there in the dark for a long time. That was step 1. Step 2 was coming at 9:03 the next morning, and they'd never see it coming. At exactly 9:03 the next morning, I sat down at my desk with my coffee, opened my banking app, and scrolled to the recurring transfer for Evans. It was the same one I'd been sending for 14 straight months. Same day, same amount, no questions asked. That morning, I didn't hesitate. My finger hovered over cancel for less than a second before I tapped it. The confirmation popped up. This payment will not be processed. That was it. No fireworks, no dramatic music, just silence in my living room and a weight lifting off my chest. I'd thought about this moment before plenty of times, usually after some small insult toward me or Leia that I brushed off for the sake of keeping the peace, but this time felt different. I'd been there when he and Tyler turned a Christmas gift, something meant for my daughter, into a public reminder that she wasn't part of their little world. And I'd stood there in my parents' living room watching my brother act like that was perfectly fine. By noon, my phone buzzed with the first message from him. "Hey, the rent didn't come through. Send it today, we're already late." No greeting, no question, just an instruction. I didn't answer. 20 minutes later. "What's going on then? Is this a mistake then? Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I still didn't answer. By mid-afternoon, the tone shifted. His wife started texting me, pretending she didn't know what was happening. "Hey, Claire, I think the rent transfer got messed up. Could you check? We've got bills due and Tyler's already stressed about the house situation." That one almost made me laugh. Tyler hadn't seemed too stressed when he was mocking my kid in front of an audience. When the text didn't work, the call started first from Evan, then from her. I let them go to voicemail. My phone pinged so often that I finally switched it to silent and put it face down on the counter. I'd learned long ago that people like them depend on your immediate reaction. They push hard and fast so you don't have time to think. I wasn't going to give them that opening. By evening, the desperation started to seep through. The messages shifted from "we need it" to "you owe us" to "what will mom and dad think when they hear about this?" And that last part told me exactly what was coming next. They were going to turn it into a family war. What they didn't know was that I'd already decided how far I was willing to go, and I wasn't backing down this time. By the next morning, Evan had widened the circle. It wasn't just him and his wife filling up my notifications anymore. Now, my parents were in on it. My mother's first text came in at 7:42 a.m. "Your brother says there's been a misunderstanding with the rent. Just send it over and clear this up before it turns into a bigger problem." There was no question in her words, just the same assumption they'd all made for years, That my role was to quietly step in, write the check, and keep the peace. I didn't reply. An hour later, my dad called. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as he left a message about how family sticks together, and how I shouldn't hold grudges over something so small. I stood in my kitchen listening to it, my coffee going cold, thinking about how easily they all minimized what had happened. My daughter getting humiliated in front of the entire family was small to them because it hadn't been their kid. By lunchtime, I started getting messages from relatives I rarely spoke to. An aunt asking if I was really going to do this to Evan right before the new year. A cousin I barely knew chiming in with, maybe just talk it out. The story had clearly been making the rounds, and Evan was the one telling it. At 1:17 p.m., my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. It was my grandfather. He doesn't call much, but when he does, it's because something matters. I answered, ready to hear another lecture, but he didn't lecture. He told me Evan had already called him, painting himself as the struggling father, blindsided by his sister's sudden cruelty. My grandfather wasn't buying it. He'd been at our parents' house the day before. He'd seen the way Evan and Tyler acted, the way Leia shut down, and he told me without hesitation, "You're not wrong, Claire. They've been using you, and you've been letting them. Enough's enough." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until the words were out of his mouth. For the first time in 2 days, I felt like I wasn't standing in this storm alone. That sense of relief didn't last long. By early evening, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Evan was standing there with Tyler. Tyler was holding the console, looking uncomfortable, muttering something that sounded halfway like an apology, but with no weight behind it. Evan said they decided to give it back to Leia, as if handing over the box somehow erased everything else. I didn't take it. I told him it was already in my house and that it was never about the game. His smile went cold. He started in about how I was punishing his son for just a joke and how I was blowing things out of proportion. I didn't argue. I simply told him I was done with the rent, with the handouts, with letting them treat my daughter like she was less than. He stared at me like he couldn't process the words. And then I saw it, that flicker when he realized the rent money wasn't coming back. Not this month. Not ever. The day after Evan stood at my door with the console, things went quiet, at least toward me. I should have known that didn't mean he was backing off. It started that afternoon when I picked Leia up from school. She walked toward the car looking puzzled, holding a small paper bag. Inside were 3 colorful game-themed keychains and a folded note. The note was in Tyler's messy handwriting. "You can come play at my house if you get your mom to stop being mad. Bring the game back, too." I asked her where it came from. She said Tyler handed it to her at lunch and told her to think about it. It wasn't an olive branch. It was bait. A 10-year-old shouldn't have to be the middleman in a financial battle between adults, but Evan had no problem putting her there. That evening, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. It was a text from Evan's wife, but she was using her sister's phone. If Leia's feeling left out, maybe she should come stay with us for the weekend. We can talk things out. I could practically hear the script in her head. Get my daughter in their house, work on her until she started repeating their version of events. I deleted it without answering. The next morning, things escalated in a way I didn't expect. My landlord called. He sounded confused and a little irritated. Apparently, Evan had contacted him directly, claiming there had been a mix-up with the rent payments and that mine had been accidentally sent to the wrong account. Then, he tried to convince the landlord to let him into my payment records so he could fix it himself. The landlord shut him down immediately and told him if he had any further complaints he needed to take them up with me, then called to give me the heads up. By that afternoon, extended family started weighing in again, but the tone had shifted. My cousin Ben called to say Evan was telling everyone I had taken Christmas away from the kids by keeping the console. In his version of the story, it had been a joint gift for both Tyler and Leia, and I'd snatched it out of spite. He left out the part where they told my daughter she wasn't smart enough to use it. Then, just as I was bracing for another exhausting night of ignored calls and texts, there was a knock on my door. It was my grandfather. He doesn't show up without a reason. And when I opened the door, I could tell he'd come straight from Evan's house. He stepped inside and set a grocery bag on the counter. Inside were Leia's favorite cookies, a small puzzle set, and 3 books he thought she'd enjoy. Then he told me exactly what had just happened. He'd gone to Evan's, listened to him and his wife try to justify everything, and then, in his words, cut through their nonsense. He told them point blank they were done embarrassing themselves and that if they kept dragging me and Leia into their games, they'd be dealing with him directly. That hit harder than I expected. My grandfather has always been the quiet, keep to himself type. But when he takes a side, he doesn't waver. Knowing he'd gone there, looked Evan in the eye and told him to stop. That was the first time since Christmas morning that I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. That night, Leah sat at the kitchen table eating one of the cookies and reading one of the books. For the first time in days, she smiled without hesitation. I should have enjoyed that moment more than I did. But I knew Evan well enough to understand he wasn't finished. And I was right. By the end of that week, the chaos was starting to wear thin, not because Evan had given up. He was still pushing, but because each new attempt seemed to chip away at whatever sympathy he still had from the rest of the family. The more he talked, the more people started noticing how much he'd been leaning on me all along. His last big move came on a Friday evening. I was at my parents' house, sorting through a box of old photos my mom wanted me to digitize. The front door opened and Evan walked in, clearly not expecting to see me there. He froze for half a second, then shifted straight into what I can only describe as performance mode. He started talking about resolving this and how the rent thing had gotten blown way out of proportion. He didn't even bother acknowledging what happened on Christmas. It was as if the only problem worth fixing was the missing money. I stayed sitting at the dining table sorting photos and told him plainly that nothing had been blown out of proportion. I'd made my decision and I wasn't reversing it. That's when he pulled out what he clearly thought would force my hand, a stack of printed screenshots. They were all messages between us from the past year. Every single time I'd agreed to cover his rent or bills. He'd even highlighted parts in yellow like it was a legal case. He claimed it was proof I'd committed to supporting him until he got back on his feet and that I was breaking my word by cutting him off. Before I could respond, my grandfather, who had been sitting quietly in the corner reading the paper, folded it and set it down. His voice was calm, but left no room for argument. He told Evan those screenshots didn't prove any kind of obligation. They proved I'd been far more generous than most people would have been. Then he leaned forward and said something that cut the air in the room. Support is a privilege. When you start treating it like a right, you've already lost it. The room went silent. Evan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to my parents for backup, but they said nothing. My grandfather didn't look away, just waited. After a moment, Evan stuffed the papers back into his folder, muttered that he had things to do, and walked out. That was the turning point. The call stopped, the group texts from relatives slowed to a trickle, and when they did come, they were more awkward than confrontational. It was like everyone had realized there was no reversing this. That weekend, Leah and I finally set up the console, not in the living room, but in her bedroom. We spent hours figuring out the controls, making mistakes, laughing every time we fell off a digital cliff. She kept looking at me with that small smile she gets when she knows something is truly hers. No one hovering over her shoulder, no one telling her she's too slow or not good enough. Evan never apologized. He never admitted he was wrong. But it didn't matter anymore. He understood now that the free ride was over. And more importantly, Leah understood that I would stand between her and anyone, family or not, who tried to humiliate her. The money I'd been sending him each month stayed in my account. The peace in my house stayed in place. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying someone else's weight. In the weeks after that Friday night at my parents' house, the ripple effect started to show. Evan didn't come around much anymore. At first, my mom covered for him, saying he was too busy or dealing with a lot, but little pieces of the truth started leaking out from other relatives. He and his wife had been scrambling to pay their rent on time. They'd sold their second car. A friend of his told my cousin they'd pawned their TV and gaming setup. Apparently, the same console he tried to use to humiliate my daughter ended up sitting in a pawn shop window with a bright orange price tag on it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't send any "I told you so" messages. I just carried on with my life. The silence from their end was enough. One afternoon, my grandfather called. It wasn't about Evan, at least not at first. He just asked how Leah was doing, how work was going, whether I was sleeping better lately, and then he said almost in passing that Evan had been over to see him. According to my grandfather, Evan admitted things were tight, but refused to explain why, still trying to save face. My grandfather had just nodded and told him, "When you burn bridges, you don't get to complain about the walk." Meanwhile, Leah seemed like a different kid. She started inviting her best friend over every Saturday, and the two of them would disappear into her room for hours to play the console. I'd hear bursts of laughter through the door, the kind that comes from being completely at ease. That sound meant more to me than any apology from Evan ever could. Then came the moment I knew the shift was permanent. My mom decided to host a Sunday dinner, small, just immediate family. I didn't expect Evan to show up, but he did. Only he was different. No leaning over Leah's shoulder. No casual jabs disguised as jokes. No territorial posturing around me. He kept his distance, spoke only when spoken to, and didn't bring up the rent once. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission in its own quiet way. The balance had changed, and he knew it. On the drive home that night, the street lights flashing through the windshield, I realized something important. For years, I'd confused silence with peace. I thought keeping the peace meant letting things slide, absorbing every little cut for the sake of family harmony. But peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of respect. That Christmas morning had been the breaking point. The rent cancellation, the confrontation, the fallout. It all led to this new reality where my boundaries weren't negotiable. Evan lost the rent money, he lost the automatic safety net. And maybe if he didn't change, he'd lose even more over time. But Leah gained something he couldn't touch. The absolute certainty that her mom would step between her and anyone, even family, if they tried to tear her down. And for me, that was worth more than every check I'd ever written combined. 10 days after that Sunday dinner, I thought the whole situation had finally settled into silence. No calls, no messages, no accidental run-ins. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, my grandfather called again, but this time he sounded almost amused. Apparently, Evan had gone to our parents and announced that he and his wife were moving to a cheaper place to have more control over their finances. My mom repeated it to my grandfather like it was some bold independent choice, but he'd already heard the real story. They were being evicted. The landlord had given them notice after months of late payments before I even cut them off. My rent help had been the only thing keeping them in that apartment, and without it, the clock finally ran out. What I didn't expect was what happened next. Evan actually reached out to me. No insults, no pressure, just a short message. We're moving out this weekend. I know we didn't end things well. I hope someday Leah will feel comfortable visiting their home again. Those were the words in his message. I read them over twice, searching for more beneath the surface. It fell short of a true apology. There was no acknowledgement of the hurt, no regret for the words spoken that Christmas morning, but coming from Evan, it was probably the nearest thing to remorse I would ever receive. I chose not to respond. It wasn't bitterness driving that silence. It was simply the recognition that everything necessary had already been expressed through actions rather than words. Sometimes, an unanswered text speaks louder and clearer than any reply ever could. That same weekend, while driving to a friend's house, I happened to pass by their old apartment. The route took me right past the building, and I couldn't help but slow down slightly. The blinds were pulled open, revealing an almost empty living room. Only a few scattered moving boxes and one overturned chair remained, casting long shadows across the bare floor. Without all the usual furniture and clutter filling the space, the room appeared strangely small and vulnerable. That fleeting glimpse stayed with me long afterward. It felt like a visual metaphor for everything they had been concealing, the financial strain, the dependence, the quiet desperation, all of it suddenly exposed in the harsh light of an empty home. Meanwhile, life on our side continued to move forward with a new sense of lightness. Leah had enrolled in an after-school art class that she absolutely loved. She would come home with paint-smudged fingers and bright sketches, telling me about the colors she mixed or the techniques she learned that day. The gaming console, once a source of pain and tension, had transformed into something purely joyful. It now lived permanently in her bedroom, where she and her friends spent hours playing together, shouting with laughter over shared victories and silly mistakes. She invited classmates over more often, and the house filled with the easy, carefree sounds of children simply being children. Most telling of all, Leah had stopped mentioning Tyler altogether. His name no longer came up in conversation, not even in passing. She didn't ask about him, didn't wonder what he was doing, didn't express any longing for the cousin who once loomed so large in her world. That quiet absence spoke volumes about how deeply she had processed the events. She had drawn her own boundaries, perhaps without even realizing it, and chosen to invest her energy in relationships that lifted her up rather than diminished her. One quiet evening, as I stood in the laundry room folding warm clothes fresh from the dryer, the deeper meaning of everything settled over me. Helping someone is only truly valuable when it is met with gratitude and respect. When respect disappears, that help stops being generosity and becomes something closer to a tether, a leash that binds the giver more tightly than the receiver. Over the years, I had allowed myself to be pulled along, convinced that maintaining family harmony required endless sacrifice. But cutting that connection wasn't an act of cruelty or revenge. It was an act of liberation, for both Leah and me. It freed us from the constant weight of obligation and from the slow erosion of our own worth. Evan's presence in our daily lives didn't end with explosive arguments or emotional scenes from a movie. There was no tearful embrace, no heartfelt reconciliation under the porch light. Instead, it faded gradually into a calm, deliberate distance. The door to renewed contact remains there, always, unlocked. In fact, should he ever learn to approach it with genuine humility and care, without trampling on the feelings of those inside. Until that day comes, if it ever does, the door stays closed. And every night, as I turn off the lights and listen to the soft, even breathing of my daughter down the hall, I rest easier than I have in years, knowing we are finally, truly free.